Good morning, everybody. I'm Jane Fielding and I'm head of the Employment, Labour and Equalities team here at Gowling WLG in the UK. And I'm very pleased to welcome you to this, which is our third webinar in our series of 4, which we're doing over last week and this week to replace our usual in-person seminar in our offices. We really hope and have everything crossed that by June we'll be able to welcome you back in person, but everything is so uncertain at the moment. Who knows? We'll have to see. But today's topic for this webinar is internal investigations. How can they reduce risk, but also add value in your organisation? The world has stopped in many ways as we knew it. We can't go to the cinema, theatre, sporting events, jump on a plane when we want to. But the rich tapestry of human behaviour has continued in various ways, and that means there's always a need for things to be investigated. Our speaker today is Simon Stephen, who's one of the legal directors in the team, and he's expertly placed to talk on this topic today. He's got a wealth of experience advising as external counsel, but he also spent a few years away from us in the team, working in an employee relations role in a major investment bank, a global investment bank, where he was actually conducting investigations, but also looking at the framework around them and how you conduct them. So he's ideally placed to share that experience from the legal and an ER perspective in the talk today. So Simon's going to talk for about 25 minutes, and we've left time at the end of this 40-minute session for questions. If you want to ask a question, please use the Q&A box, which you should find in the bottom of your Zoom screen in the middle. I'll keep an eye on the questions as Simon does his talk, and we'll try and pick up as many of them as we can at the end. You can also use that Q&A box if you've got any technical issues, and Lucy Strong, who's helping us with the tech for the event today, will do her best to get those sorted for you. Hopefully there won't be any tech issues at all and it will all go smoothly, and you won't need to do that, but just in case. So on that note, I will hand over to Simon for the presentation.
Well, thank you, Jane. No pressure on my Wi-Fi then. Let's hope it stands up to this. So good morning, everyone. Thank you very much for joining us. Really value you taking the time to come and listen. Hopefully you'll get some value out of this. What I'm going to cover, leading on from what Jane has said, is a talk really about how to get the most out of investigation rather than kind of nuts and bolts of how to conduct the investigation itself. I'm going to use my experience from in-house as well as kind of in private practice and from being involved in many different types of investigations. At the moment, it feels like that is pretty much my day job. So I'm going to cover, first of all, a bit of back to basics about what investigation is and what investigation isn't, because it's very important, I think, to focus and kind of fall back on the basics when doing investigations. I'm also then going to run through the importance of having a framework, a structure in place, and as part of that, talk through the importance of planning and scoping investigations, and then finally just running through how best to get learning out of the investigation, where you can really add the value from doing so. So first up, what is investigation? Well, it probably sounds a very kind of basic, silly question when doing a talk on investigations. But as I said before, I do think it really is important to fall back on what the basics are, particularly, I think, in the disturbed times we are in now, where it can be a bit easier maybe to lose focus. And of course, you're not in the office. People aren't in the presence of each other, kind of seeking help and guidance and picking things up. But what an investigation is, and this applies to any different types of investigations, is threefold, really. First of all, it's a means of collating and understanding information. And understanding that point before embarking on any investigation or doing anything investigation-wise is really important to remember, because the focal point of it is gathering information, making sure it's understood. Because if the investigation doesn't understand it, no one else is going to really, particularly if that investigation is going to be tested in litigation. And then once you've gone through the process of collating and understanding the information, the investigation can then establish and present the facts that that information shows. And again, it's very important to remember that an investigation is, in essence, at its heart, it's a means of establishing facts, demonstrating what they are. And then finally, those facts can then be used as the basis for an independent decision. And of course, investigations can take many different forms and many different shapes. It might be a disciplinary investigation in which the decision is being taken by a completely different party. It may even be taken by, a decision might be taken by an investigator themselves, depending on the remit of it, but they can only do that having done the previous points of establishing and presenting facts, which are based on collating and understanding information. So I think keeping that core structure and core focus in mind at all times is very important. But of course, we have to also think about what an investigation is not. Investigation is not, it's very different from a criminal procedures. It's very different from litigation. It isn't litigation by proxy. And indeed, in most of the civil kind of issues which arise during investigations, and particularly in the employment and the HR sphere, the burden of proof is all based on the balance of probabilities. What you're looking at is identifying facts, you're pulling it together and presenting it from which a decision can be made. I think investigations can be tempting for individuals to start playing being a bit of a police officer, kind of letting out that inner Miss Marple or other detective, whichever your favorite might be. But I think it's really important to make sure that those principles are borne in mind. And that's why it's important to fall back on those three kind of issues I talked about at the beginning, because the risk there, if an investigation is not focusing on those three bits, if it does go off piste, is that you're going to go down rabbit warrens. You're going to start looking into places where you don't need to look. To find the kind of the holy grail or the smoking gun. And indeed, you may start looking in places where you shouldn't be looking. So it's very important to kind of to bear that in mind as well. Of course, there are many different types of investigation as well. And I put up there on the side kind of the 5 key ones which we advise and kind of get involved in, carry out ourselves. But the points are that the principles for any investigation apply to whichever investigation it is. If it's a disciplinary investigation, the same principles really generally apply to one that is a grievance, and the same with whistleblowing and fraud, all the way up to regulatory. Of course, there are horses for courses. There are different things you might do, but the core principles all apply to the same type of investigation. That doesn't mean, of course, that you have to have a full-blown investigation with external barristers and kind of advisory working parties, etc., for each and every one. You might be more inclined to have those for regulatory ones and fraud ones, and perhaps whistleblowing as well. But sometimes they won't need that. Sometimes it might even be the disciplinary investigation which needs that because of the sensitivities. But it's important to understand that no matter what you're looking at, taking a step back and looking at exactly what it is that you want to achieve. So as part of that, when you're looking at the investigation, you've reminded yourself about what the investigation is. You've identified the type of investigation it is, but there's still a number of things that then still need to be looked at in order to kind of carry out the investigation properly. I put the kind of the principal ones up on here, but you're going to have to look at whether you want to have a privileged investigation or whether it's not going to be privileged. There are benefits to each, but of course, if you have a privileged investigation, whilst you get the benefit of the legal advice privilege, you get the benefit of it not being able to be shared shared during tribunal proceedings or litigation. You're then stuck with the fact that actually, if you want to do any action with it, what do you do with that question of privilege? So that kind of all needs to be considered out of the outset. And of course, you need to think also as well about who's going to carry out the investigation. Could well be an internal investigator. In fact, most investigations are, and in the context of the employment world, they're likely to be human resources or employee relations team. But it could also be some other designated body within the company. For example, a fraud team, or maybe your compliance teams carry out investigations as well. And it's important to identify that type of investigator, or who's going to be that investigator. So you can also make sure that who else is involved as needs be. And I'll come on to that later when we talk about frameworks. It's also important before embarking on investigation to think about whether you need an external investigator. Of course, as an external legal advisor, I greatly enjoy doing that, and it's great when we get that because it's great work to be involved in. But you've got to think very carefully about whether the investigation needs that or merits it. And the 3 kind of primary types of external investigator that you're likely to see is using a barrister or a lawyer. You can do independent investigations. They have the benefit of being governed by professional regulatory rules and also have the expertise of understanding the law particularly around employment cases. And that can be very beneficial as well. But likewise, you might need a consultant if it's a particular type of issue. You can think of diversity and inclusion, for example, if there's issues around that to be investigated, is there a specialist in that field, consultant who you may want to engage? And likewise with an expert. You may be looking at investigation, which is something which is quite a niche issue, and the people who have expertise internally may be conflicted, for example, if it's a small body, so it may be best to take external advice. So that's a quick kind of overview of the types of investigation and the key principles to think about when thinking what investigation is going to be carried out. But what I want to then move on to is the importance of having an investigation framework. I think here what is important is that making sure that to get the value out of investigations and to make sure that there's risk is mitigated, it's very important to make sure, in my view, and this kind of comes from personal experience as well through running them and through running governance programs in-house, is that there is the general framework and understanding of how investigations are run in the company, what they are, what they're there to achieve, and also who else is going to be involved. So I've put there on the slide kind of a bit of a mind map on it. At the top is that general principle point, making sure that the general principles of investigations are very clearly set out. So anyone involved in an investigation in any context, or any people who kind of work within them, understand the general principles from which they are to work. And I'm not saying here that you need to have very detailed policies and procedures. I, for one, am not one to advise on having policies and procedures for the sake of it. I know many of you will already have many in place, but it's very important to have set out kind of those overarching principles so people understand. Then that feeds back down into the teams of investigators or investigators that you have. You may have a number of different people who carry out investigations in different ways. Of course, we're not just looking at HR and employment ones here. Making sure that they follow the same principles is going to be very important, because you get consistency and making sure that actually everyone understands what is going on and they understand their roles and how it ends up. And as part of that framework is also important, in my view, to make sure that the investigation team and the investigators involved in it understand who the correct stakeholders are with whom they need to engage. For example, if you've got an HR and employment case which may have an element of fraud, it may be that you need to link up with the internal fraud team. Now, this could be for a number of different reasons, but it's likely to be that the internal fraud team will have their own remit and their own key operating procedures, which will require them to be involved in some way or form or another. So it's important that in the framework it's set out how different parties, how different stakeholders will interact. And of course, there's the added bit there about the learning and development teams. How is any learnings from the investigation going to be drawn out? And the framework can set this all out so it's very clear. And as part of that, of course, there's the escalation points as well. To whom do people go with particular issues, such as whistleblowing and things like that? As the investigation goes on, are there whistleblowing elements? Who do you contact and things like that? So I think having that consistent framework will greatly assist the investigation go smoothly and make sure all the information and processes are captured. And of course, that links up with the control owners as well. If you're doing an investigation where there is an element of a control failure or control breach, it's important to make sure that, of course, confidentiality permitting, that control owner is involved as well, not least so that they know what is coming. As an example from my in-house days, I was involved in a big investigation involving procurement issues. So looking into that, and there were going to be learning points that came out of that. So from the very early days on, we linked up with the procurement team and the learning and development team to make sure that they were kind of aware that this was kind of coming up. And of course, then that meant that any policies or procedures which were being looked at in the meantime could factor in the fact that there was going to be some learning points coming along the way. If we hadn't done that, then it could well have been the case that a new policy, new training was launched without any input, which then defeats really the purpose of doing it. And of course, having the framework as well can set out clearly where the advice comes from. Who is going to advise on the principles? Who is going to advise about, provide the independent HR advice, for example, or legal advice? And what are the parameters around external advice? When should you get these? And then looking back at the types of investigation from the previous slides, the framework can build in the parameters and kind of principles for when those different types of investigation kick in. when should an investigation be privileged, when should a case involve an external investigator. So I think having it all in one place will greatly assist kind of those carrying them out and really help to add value towards the end. And of course, as part of that framework in itself, you're building the responsibilities of the investigator, making sure that the investigator or the investigation teams, those responsible for investigations, have a very clear remit, they know what they're doing, and they know where their responsibilities sit within this wider framework, within the wider organization. So in the colourful triangle or pyramid that we've got there, right at the core of that is the process. The investigator and the investigation team, they are responsible for their own process. So if you have a human resources or employee relations team, it is their process, they own it. But it's their responsibility to make sure that fits in within the wider framework, which means you have to make sure that they communicate properly with the other stakeholders, set out in my mind map. So for example, taking the fraud case as an example, does the HR/ER team liaise with fraud team to make sure that they're following consistent patterns or the right things are being done in line with each other's kind of own responsibilities. And the investigation team will have the responsibility to make sure they source advice in the proper way, in the appropriate way, and in a consistent way, which matches along with the framework. And likewise, perhaps most importantly, it's their responsibility to make sure that the correct people are trained. So the investigation team are trained in the process and in the comms and in the framework to make sure that when they are doing the investigation, they don't do anything which is outside what the company expects. And they do it with all in this framework, with all in the whole remit, so that the decisions made are consistent. So to recap on that, the value, I think, of a framework for investigations is at the top is accountability and quality. By having a framework, by having a structure in place by which everyone operates, you can really make sure that it's very clear who is accountable for what, and it can really help enhance the quality of the investigation. And the better the quality of the investigation is, the less risk there's going to be, and the more value you can get out of it. And of course, the better it is, and the more clear the framework is, the less cost it'll be, and the quicker you'll be able to get things done. But I think also really importantly, a value for a framework is to have consistency. That's consistency across an investigation team. You've got an HR team, an ER team, you may have a number of different people, maybe even sitting responsible for different business units. And from the holistic point of view, as I said, you want people to be following the same general principles in line with that framework. So it's really important to have that in there. And of course, globally, if you have a global organization, there's going to be investigation teams across many different jurisdictions, different time zones. And whilst the law and process are very, very different, to the extent you can align things, make sure it's consistent, or at least people understand each other's roles and why things have to be done differently. And of course, this leads to strengthening numbers and partnering. You can share lessons learned, you can share processes, kind of best practice, and it just generally helps to keep that communication flow by having a framework with all those involved in investigations. And then ultimately that then leads to improvement, and as I said before, getting kind of more value out of your investigation process. So we understand what investigation is, and we've looked at putting in a framework. And I think actually, just before I go on to the planning thing, when I talk about framework, I'll just stress again, I'm not saying you have to have some all singing, all dancing format in place. It's just making sure that actually you have something in place which binds everyone together and helps with that consistency, which can then apply to any investigation, no matter how small or big. But I think in particular, so moving on to planning, I think planning then becomes the key bit about making sure that the specific investigation you're carrying out is one which is fit for purpose, carries less risk, and ultimately you can benefit from. And I think that is particularly so at the time now in COVID, where actually investigations can be quite difficult. And I'll kind of talk through some of the practicals for that, but it's going to add in a lot more different considerations. Now, I did think about having a more exciting slide here for this with some quotes from Baldrick from Blackadder about cunning plans, but ultimately I went down the vanilla route of just splitting planning into 4 stages. So they are scoping. So scoping the investigation is going to be absolutely key, making sure you understand what it is that you're doing, and then making sure you've got the right materials in which to carry out that scope. And then you've got to plan about what your report is going to look like. How are you going to finish this investigation? And then the final bit, I think, is often the bit that gets forgotten, and this is the bit where it can really add value, is what happens after the investigation is done, what happens with the report. So coming on to these bits broken down, I said planning is a fundamental aspect to mitigate risk and adding value. So if you're looking at planning, the first bit of scope, this is where the framework comes into use, because you can use that to look at actually what is the investigation I'm doing, how does it fit in with that framework? Should this be a privileged investigation? If it is, who do I need to get sign off on that, for examples? But also as part of the scope, we're looking at what the issues are. And again, this falls back into what the purpose of the investigation is, about the understanding and collating facts and then presenting them. What are the facts that I need to present? What are the issues that we're looking at? And you could then look in the scope as to the boundaries. And particularly, I think it's very important in investigations to set out what is, well, not necessarily set out, but be clear about what isn't included in an investigation. So you don't then run the risk of becoming of unleashing your inner police officer, going down rabbit warrens and going down places where you don't need to go to meet the purpose of that investigation. So once you've got your scope clear, it's then really important to plan out your materials and who are you going to speak to and how are you going to speak to them. It's very different now with COVID. Of course, we're not in the office, or not many of us are in the offices. So how are you going to arrange that? If it's going to be by Zoom, Teams, how is that going to work with the individual? You may even have issues with people who are on furlough. What is your approach going to be on interviewing or investigating people who are on furlough? You've also got to think then about the added risk of people, and actually what support can we give to that person? Are any of these people I'm going to interview, these witnesses or indeed the subjects, are they more vulnerable? Is it going to be more stressful for them to do it without doing it in person? So thinking about how you're going to go about that. And likewise with the materials, about the documents and the data that you're going to be looking at, what is it that you're going to need and how are you going to get it? It may be that you need expense data, so you need to think about doing things like that. But I think particularly in COVID time, thinking about actually where is that information, where is that data? Is it going to be in kind of Skype chats, for example? Is it going to be in WhatsApp? What's our policy in WhatsApp? Can I get hold of people's private, WhatsApp chats? Or indeed, are there issues with Zoom? Can I get Zoom history and things like that? You've got to really proactively think right at the outset, what are we going to do? Because a lot of this information is going to be accessed in a different way because of the COVID issues. And I think as well as part of the materials, think about if there's any experts you might need to look at. I'm not necessarily meaning external experts, a lot of conversations about experts in the press, but maybe internal. So if you're looking at something, and I'll use the expenses investigations as an example, if you're looking at an issue into the expenses, into expense misuse, do you need to get somebody who actually owns that policy, owns that process to tell you what it is? How are you going to kind of build all that in? But it could also be experts in niche things like market trading, how things, all those work as well. So you've got to plan all that. And also as part of the planning, making sure that you understand what the report is going to be. I say report because most investigations will end up with a formal report of some sort. As part of the scoping, as part of the planning for this, make sure it's clear about what that report is going to be used for. Who is it going to be seen by, and what are they going to use it for? And then you can think about the format of that report, and then you can build in about who is going to see it and how is it going to be distributed. I'm just closing off a detailed investigation which has been going on for a number of months, and one of the most difficult parts of that is once we've got the report is who is going to see it and how are we going to take it forward. Part of the planning right at the outset with a valued working party has meant that that process is quite smooth and we're able just to kind of close it off and move forward. So it's really important to build that in. And then the final bit about planning is this point I made earlier about the planning in the post-report kind of phase. One of the big risks with investigations, and one of the big risks of them not adding value, is the dangers of them sitting there gathering dust. Some investigations can take a long time, and whilst something might be an exciting issue to start off with, it can lose that excitement, lose that gloss kind of as things go on. So it's really important to make sure that as part of the process, you're already thinking right at the outset of the planning about what we're going to do with this report, what are we going to do with the findings of this investigation. And as part of that, it's important to plan what's next in the process. Now, that maybe not be for the investigator themselves to plan, but somebody, whoever is kind of responsible, whoever's commissioned the investigation, if you like, has to already know what is next and what's going to happen with the report. But I think it's also important than anything about what happens after that. What happens after that next stage. And an easy example is the disciplinary process. You have an investigation, which then goes through a disciplinary meeting. That's the next step in the process. After that, there's going to be an appeal process. So as part of the planning, there's the investigator who's planning what they're going to do, but it has to be someone else planning about what they are then going to do with the investigation themselves. And as part of that planning about who is responsible for things, who is responsible for taking it forward, who is responsible for making sure the investigation happens, who is responsible for making sure that any action points are then actually kind of addressed and documented. And as part of that planning, who would advise in the next stage? Often the advice for an investigation is independent advice kind of at that particular stage. If there's going to be another stage, and again, the disciplinary process is an easy example, who is then going to give that independent advice to the disciplinary and to the appeal to make sure that the independence of the investigation is not compromised. So all that planning, all that kind of thinking things through, then leads us to, obviously what happens after the report, but I think it then leads to making sure that you get the best out of your investigation, getting the value. Of course, the primary point of the investigation is to identify the facts for the particular issue, and then making sure you can take that forward. But I think, as with any investigation, from the very smallest one from a disciplinary through to the biggest regulatory one, there are always going to be learning points that come out from it. And there are two reasons why they're very important to build in terms of risk and value. I think the value one probably speaks for itself. If there are learning points, improvements, it's going to be pretty vital and crucial to pick those up and make sure they're dealt with. But also from a risk point of view, if an investigation makes findings and an investigation identifies facts, particularly control errors or things like that, then making sure that the learning points are addressed, well, it should mitigate the risk of that issue happening again. And it will also mitigate against the risk of an employment tribunal in another case saying, well, actually, you've had this before, but you still didn't do anything about it. So it's very important to kind of build that in. So what I've put here on the slide is what I call the continuous learning cycle. I don't think that's kind of particularly my own phrase, but it works for here. And what this is, that when you get the outcome of a report, as I said, there's always going to be learning points. There's always going to be feedback. It's important to make sure that those learning points and feedback are collated and pulled together. And then somebody then thinks about how we can put those learning points forward. And I'm going to fall back to my framework before, my suggestion of the framework before. As part of that process, you can document who those stakeholders are. If you remember, I mentioned the learning and the development teams. You can build it into the process that everybody understands that this is what happens. So what you do, how you do it, you feed that back in. There are then the obligations then on that team to implement those learning points, whether they are through training or through control reviews, whatever they might be. And as part of that, you then when you next go through another process, an investigation process or an expense, whatever it might be, those learning points, those control improvements, that training all feeds up into that. And then you should get ideally a better outcome for the actual issue itself, and also a better outcome for the next investigation. So it really is a continuous learning cycle. And as part of that, I think there are 4 questions to ask when doing the investigation and as part of the planning. The first is, what was the investigation asked to do? What is the purpose? What was the information that was supposed to be understood? What were the facts that were going to be presented, and kind of what then happened? And then, where are the action points, recommendations? Where are they kept? Where are they tracked? Who has responsibility for taking them forward? This is the risk of investigations gathering dust or not adding the value. It's done, people move on, and it just sits there. Making sure that those action points and recommendations are kept and tracked, and then somebody has responsibility for taking them forward is going to be really important. And then finally, who has accountability for closure? How do you close this off? Who is it who has ultimately responsibility for that? Very important to make sure that is clear, because then that should then happen. The report should then be closed off, the learning points are moved forward, and you move into the continuous learning cycle. And again, I'll just fall back onto the point about the framework. All of these questions, all of these points can be added in to that framework and that overarching kind of process itself. So I think I've reached the end of the talk. I kind of reached the allotted time there. What I wanted to achieve from that was to go through a kind of a holistic overview about how companies, I think, should take investigations forward and approach them. Of course, there are many, many kind of questions and the nuts and bolts for investigations, which I could have gone through, but that would be a kind of another day talk in itself. But of course, we are now going to be open for questions. If there's any follow-ups after this webinar in itself, then very happy to receive them as well.
Thanks, Simon. We have had quite a few questions through on the Q&A, so we'll take as many of those as we can in the last 8-9 minutes or so of the webinar. So the first one, I think, picks up on a point you made about investigations themselves potentially being global, but it broadens that out in the sense that often there are stakeholders outside the UK. So if you're a UK subsidiary of, say, a US parent, and the stakeholders who are interested in the outcome of the investigation will be coming from different legal, cultural perspectives. Do you have any advice? I think this is the question on how best you can engage when you have that dimension in an investigation.
Yeah, it's a great question there. But I think one of the problems there is that often things like that don't come to the mind until something goes wrong, when there is a clash. And I think that's actually a point I maybe should have made at the outset, is that by having all these frameworks and things in place, you can kind of hopefully prevent the learning from things going wrong. A lot of it depends on kind of how engaged kind of people are, those different stakeholders. I would see, if I'm doing an investigation, I would see kind of my US or counterparts in other jurisdictions as a stakeholder and building it into the framework. So that's why I think having the framework, having those kind of principles is really important. And a lot of it is, it's hard. I'm not going to lie about that. It's hard because it's very different, making sure people understand why, if you're interviewing someone in the UK, they need to be represented, these kind of things. But I think it's very much kind of building into the process and making sure that actually you have the engagement with different bodies and doing some form of training or get to know or kind of roadshow or even just getting together in it. Well, obviously not a room these days, but get together for a half-day workshop to say, look, this is how things run and how and why, with some case studies of kind of, how a tribunal works. And indeed, putting some horror stories. I always found when I was in-house that the best way to get kind of attention is to demonstrate, actually, if we don't do this, this is how much it costs in the UK. So kind of, putting in those horror stories, I think. So it's not easy, but kind of going through that engagement process, using the framework and trying to get people to see each other as stakeholders is going to be the way. Okay, thank you. So there's another one here which sort of goes right back to the beginning of any investigation, in a sense, as part of the plan. And it's quite specific, but who chooses the investigator? That depends on kind of how it's all set out for your company, what works best for your company. But I think, again, that's very important to have the framework which sets out who chooses it. And you then have control in a way on who the investigators are. Because what you don't want is for people to go and choose their friend who they know from old, someone they might used to work with, because then the big questions about independence, and that can add real risk when it's challenged later on, which is this isn't a fair and reasonable investigation because it's your mate from school. Kind of approach. So there's no kind of hard and fast answer to who that is, but it's important to have it set out about who it is. And it goes back to that kind of points about the types of investigations, external, internal. Often it will sit with legal or indeed whoever is responsible for that. So if if you have an employee relations team and they're the ones who are responsible for those investigations, it will be their choice possibly, but with the guidance of legal. But it's very important to make it and keep track about who those investigators are, so you don't always use the same person and always make sure they're all properly trained, etc. But it's a choice for the company to make, but it should be made in a consistent way in line with the framework. Yeah, and availability is often really key, isn't it? Because I think people tend to think it's an add-on to the day job, but actually when you're in the middle of one, it needs to be your day job to some extent, doesn't it? So that you're not responsible for delay.
So there's another question here, was a couple of questions actually around the investigator's role and the scope. So one is, in an employee disciplinary investigation, what is your advice about whether the investigator should actually be recommending whether there's a case to answer, or whether they should limit their report just to findings of fact, and then somebody else makes that decision as to whether it goes on to the next stage?
Yep, I think either way works. I think again, I said I'm kind of doing advising investigations is kind of my day job and what I do. And a number of the clients I work with, they don't want the investigator to make recommendations, because they in fact leave that for the body internally who kind of decides, so they can have consistency and make sure that kind of it's in line with how they do these things. But others want the investigator to make the recommendations, so it truly is a genuine independent referral that actually there are cases to answer. So again, it's horses for courses. I'll put and I'll come off the fence there and say my personal preference is for a report to make recommendations that there is a case to answer, or that actually there are facts which aren't aligned with the policy. This are the facts of the policy, these are the facts, on the face of it there's a case to answer, because it just gives it gives a purpose for the investigation, and then it enables a disciplinary panel to really look at that kind of and then just make their own decision based on that.
Okay, so there are a couple of questions here which I'm going to take together, and apologies if anybody can hear my dogs. Somebody was supposed to be keeping them quiet, but they seem to have broken out. So there's a question about the scope of investigations. So sometimes as you investigate, you start off with your terms of reference and the things you're looking at, and then other incidents of misconduct are uncovered along the way. So what tips do you have for whether it's okay to investigate those? If so, how do you do it to avoid the employee saying, well, this is just a witch hunt? You're determined to try and find something that you can get me on.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I don't think there's any investigation I've done or advised on where that hasn't happened, or something's uncovered. And because whatever you look at, so you get data, you get kind of internal chat messages or something like that. There's always something there, referral to something on WhatsApp, and you think, oh goodness me, what's that? So I think two kind of primary ways of dealing with that. One is in the terms of reference, make it clear what will happen if new things come up, what that process will be. And that could just be 2 lines, if other things come to light, this is what will happen. But again, you kind of fall back on kind of the guiding principles and the frameworks to make sure that actually whose decision is that to investigate further. I don't think it's the investigator's decision to make. If something else comes up, it's the investigator to come back to the company, to whoever is commissioning them, whoever has responsibility, to say, okay, what do I do with this? Then a decision can be taken. And again, it's kind of that, avoiding being Miss Marple or Poirot, or whoever it might be, to say, actually, do we need to do this as part of this? Can that wait? Do we actually care? A lot of the times things come up in the heat of investigation and you get carried away. You think, oh, it's more excitement. And then you think, actually, no, I don't, obviously I care, but it isn't of interest right now. We can park that, or indeed that's for somebody else to deal with. So I think it's always good to make sure the investigator is clear about what they are to do, making sure that in the terms of reference it's clear to an individual that if things do come up, it may be investigated, but setting out kind of who will make that decision and how that will then be communicated.
Okay, thanks. So we have actually run out of time and not got to all the questions, but as Simon mentioned earlier, we will come back to any of you who had a question that we've not managed to get to in the time available. And thanks to all of you who've put those in the Q&A. So that's the end of the webinar now. You will get a request to do some feedback popping up in your internet browser. We'd be really grateful if you could fill that in. We do read them and take account of your thoughts for shaping future sessions. So that would be really helpful if you can find a couple of minutes to do that. Otherwise, I hope you found that informative, and we hope to see as many of you as possible at our 4th and last webinar in this series on Thursday, when we're going to be looking at dismissing senior executives. So hope to see as many of you there as possible, but otherwise hope you have a good day. Thank you.
Thank you.